Today we are going to see threads and CPU scheduling in operating system. Single and multi-threaded process. You have code, data, files, registers or stack in a process. This process is called as a thread. A program which is in execution state is called as a thread. What is a single threaded process? Only one process is actually running inside the memory, then it is inside the CPU, then it is called as single threaded process. And the multi-threaded process is more than one process executing at the same time, then it is called as multi-threaded process. If it is a single threaded process, so it is going to use code, data, files, registers and stack. But when you are using multi-threaded process, each thread will have a separate code, registers and stack for its use. What is the benefit of a thread? Responsiveness, resource sharing, economy, utilization of microprocessor architectures. Responsiveness is nothing but when a user wants to run a program, then it is executed and the result will be shown to the user. So this is called as responsiveness. Resource sharing. Resource is nothing but that stack data, code, registers and everything what we have seen in the previous slide. So this resources can be shared between more than one process. So resource sharing is available in multi-threaded processing. Economy. Instead of waiting for a thread to be executed and then assigning the next thread, you can use at the same CPU more than one process executing at the same time. So as it is executing at the same time, the price or the amount or the memory space, time taken, everything is reduced. So it builds up the economy. Utilization of microprocessor architectures. So more than one processor is utilized. So that is the multi-processor processing architecture. User threads. Thread management done by user level threads library. So use some of the example of user level threads is POSIX P threads, Java threads, Win32 threads. Win32 is a Windows 32-bit system, and that Windows 32 process whatever we execute, start its execution, a thread will be correspondingly started. And whenever the process gets executed, the thread will also be stopped. Similarly, Java threads. Any Java program, when you start executing, a thread corresponding for the Java program is in process. Once the execution is over, the thread process will also be stopped. Kernel threads. This is supported by the kernel. Kernel is a software used in the operating system, which is the backbone of the operating system. So without kernel, the operating system will not work. Some of the examples of kernel threads, Solaris and Linux. What is multi-threading models? We have many types in multi-threading models. One is many to one. Many threads will be connected to one thread. One to one. One single thread will be connected to another single thread. Many to many. Many multiple threads will be connected to many multiple threads. So these are the types of multi-threading models. What is many to one? Many user level threads is mapped to a single kernel thread. So whenever the user starts a program for execution, a thread is created and this user level thread will be connected to the kernel because the operating system will also have a thread correspondingly for each process the user is executing. So that is the kernel thread. So many user level threads will be mapped to a single kernel thread. And some of the examples are Solaris green threads. What is many to one model? So many user threads will be connected to one kernel thread. So many user process can be executed at the same time in the kernel thread, in the kernel. So the thread created by the kernel will be one, and this inside this thread itself, all the user threads gets executed. And what is one to one? Each user level thread maps to kernel thread. So that is one to one. So examples, Windows, Linux, and Solaris. So this is the one-to-one model. So one user thread will be connected to each of the user thread will be connected to one kernel thread. So that is the one-to-one model. Many-to-many model. So allows many user level threads to be mapped to many kernel threads. It creates a sufficient number of kernel threads, whatever the type of operating system used by the user. It creates a sufficient number of kernel threads. Windows NT Solaris prior to version 9, where the types of using many to many threads. So this is the diagrammatic representation of many to many model. So for many user threads, many kernel threads can be connected. What are the threading issues? Semantics of fork and execute function of system calls to be executed whenever a thread is in process. Execute is the command for executing the thread, and fork is a command for executing the sub-process. Thread cancellation is another issue. Signal handling, thread pools, thread-specific data, scheduler activities. Semantics of fork and execute. Does fork duplicate only the calling thread or all the threads? Fork is a command which is used in Unix for executing the subprocess. So whenever more than one thread is executing at the same time, all the threads will have a subfunction. So do we need to make a duplicate copy of the fork function for executing all the threads? So the coding of the semantics is nothing but the coding of fork and execute need not be duplicated. It is enough if you use one time. If for every thread, it gets executed. Thread cancellation. Thread that is a running process can be cancelled at any time. So that cancellation is based on two types: asynchronous cancellation and deferred cancellation. Asynchronous cancellation terminates the target thread immediately. Deferred cancellation allows the target thread to periodically check if it should be cancelled. So whatever problem comes when a process is executing, and if any problem needs to make the threads to be cancelled, when it is an asynchronous cancellation approach, it will automatically, without asking the reason, the thread processing will be cancelled. That is asynchronous cancellation. Deferred cancellation is every time, once the cancellation needs to happen, every time the cancellation, the process will be checked, the thread will be checked whether it needs to be cancelled. So the time till the thread can be executed without cancellation, that will be allowed. So, and it is periodically checked whether in which point it needs to be cancelled, whether it's to be cancelled now or after 5 minutes, it can be cancelled. So that 5 minutes, the code in the thread will be executed. So this type of cancellation is called as deferred cancellation. What is signal handling? Signals are used in Unix systems to notify a process that a particular event has occurred. A signal handler is used to process the signals. That signal handler is generated by particular event. and it is delivered to a process and the signal will be handled. So the options: deliver the signal to the thread to which the signal applies, deliver the signal to every thread in the process, or deliver the signal to certain threads in the process, assign a specific thread to receive all signals for the process. So any type of options can be utilized for giving the signal to each and every process. So that the signals will be handled by either one thread, or it could be handled by all the threads, or it could be handled by the chosen threads, so that the signal will be handled according to the need. Thread pools. The process which are in ready state to get executed in the CPU, that process will be stored in a pool or in a pool, that is a queue. So a queue, there is a waiting queue where the threads are in ready state to get executed is called as a thread pool. What is the advantage of using this pool is usually slightly faster to service a request with an existing thread than create a new thread. The service of these thread pool threads will be very faster. So if it is a multiprocessing, more than one thread can be applied to a single kernel thread. And it allows the number of threads in the applications to be bound to the size of the pool. So if the size of the pool is large, the threads needs to be created large. If the size of the pool is very less, the number of threads will also be very less. Thread specific data allows each thread to have its own copy of data. So for each thread, data will be in multiple copies. Data will be in multiple copies for each and every thread, so that every thread need not wait for the data from the other threads. Useful when you do not have control over the thread creation process. So if the thread creation process is not properly working, then the data will be in the thread which is in executing process. If the thread is not having its own data, so the thread needs to wait for the execution. Thread needs to wait for the execution until the data is delivered from other threads to this thread. Scheduler activations, both many-to-many and two-level models require communication to maintain the appropriate number of kernel threads allocated to the application. Scheduler activations provide upcalls, a communication mechanism from the kernel to the thread library. This communication allows an application to maintain the correct number of kernel threads.